announcement is really just to introduce our seminar speaker. So, which is not a seminar, this is just a sort of a special event. We decided that it would be really useful to have somebody from NASA headquarters give us a talk about how the ROSES system, the proposal system, has been evolving over the last couple of years, just what's the state of affairs with it now, and then just a general advice of sort of do's and don'ts of proposal writing. It's a little bit aimed at early career, but all of us could probably use that advice, right? And so Max is on the line from NASA headquarters now. And he should be able to share his slides. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Here we go. Yes, I'm from Mac. So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Great. All right. So yes, the original concept was do's and don'ts about proposal writing, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about our ROSES solicitation in case you're not already familiar with it. And Sean has got a copy of these slides, so you can refer to them later, and they're links to useful things. So I'll just go through that first introduction to the solicitation part kind of quickly. If you hear people talk about ROSES, that's the research opportunities in space and Earth science. So it's comes out every year on February 14th or thereabout. So it's ROSES for Valentine's Day. Haha. And so right now we're sort of late in ROSES 2023. The next one, ROSES 24, will come out next February. And this is an omnibus or umbrella solicitation. So what that means is that within it are over 100 individual program elements, is what we call them. But those are the calls for proposals. And each has its own topic and its own due date and its own point of contact and cadence and stuff like that. So yeah, anyway, there are some links here to the Google Calendar and the blog of amendments. And, I'll maybe talk about that. That it's sort of, the release date is sort of arbitrary. It's not totally done when it goes out. There are TBD placeholders, and then it changes over the course of the year. The first thing that you need to know about ROSES is, well, and just frankly, solicitations at NASA in general, is that they tend to have this layered structure because there's a lot of blah, blah that, maybe you don't need to know at all, or maybe you need to know once or rarely. And so you have this sort of default guidance for the agency in an agency guidebook. And then ROSES has this summary of solicitation that, again, has sort of default backstop rules. And then ROSES is divided into these divisions, which are the way that we're funded: astrophysics, biological and physical sciences, planetary science, earth science, so on. And each one of those divisions corresponds to an appendix, A, B, C, D, and so on, in ROSES. And then in each one of those is these many calls for proposals. So this will perhaps become more obvious. But the bottom line is that the most important thing, and the place where you start, is that PDF file that's maybe just 3 or 4, maybe could be as long as a dozen pages, that has the technical call for proposals. And if you're happy with that, if that answers all of your questions, then you're done. You don't have to go elsewhere. But it may be, in fact, it often is, that in those technical calls for proposals, there are things that they don't bother to mention, like the font size or something. And that's something that you would find in these higher level documents like the summary of solicitation. So anyway, the basic parts of ROSES that you need to know is, first of all, table 1, that's the checklist that has the basic parts of each proposal and the order in which they should appear. By default, Any given call for proposals may add or subtract something. Tables 2 and 3 are HTML tables of due dates, organized either chronologically by due date or by topic. And I'll show you an example of that. And then there's the summary of solicitation. That's the blah, blah I was talking about. And then each one of the divisions has a research overview. Like A1 is for earth science, and that one is really great. They really take a lot of time and they really talk about their philosophy and how things are organized. There are other overviews that are much more minimal. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this because maybe you guys, maybe you all know all about roses. I'm just moving along. This is just an example of table 1 of roses. Tells you, okay, this is the third part of the proposal, and it tells you something about it, maybe provides a link to a FAQ, you know, something like that. Here's an example of table 2 of roses sorted by due date. So you can see all the different letters and numbers are just mixed in together, right? B, that's heliophysics. F, you know, that's the cross division programs and so on. And so the way this works is that it's organized by the 4th column, which is the proposal due date. But then you have this 3rd column that has, well, if it just gives a date and nothing else, that's a notice of intent. If it says NA, they're not asking for one. If it says mandatory, then you better do it, because if you don't submit that NOI, then you may not submit a proposal. And step 1 proposals are always mandatory. And then as you can see down here in the lower right, some say no due date, which just means submit it whenever you want. And I should just say that the difference here is that a notice of intent is submitted by the PI whenever they want. So, you know, you can have your feet up in your pajamas at home and you just as an individual submit that NOI from your couch. But any proposal, including a step 1 proposal, is submitted by your organization. So you have to release it to your university and then they click submit. So, and then the other thing that I wanted to mention is I alluded to the fact that it changes after release. The release on Valentine's Day is arbitrary. This is a ginormous thing and everything is not done when we release it. And so what happens is there are many TBD placeholders. And then we say later, well, we're going to release the final text later when it's ready. And when we do, we'll do an amendment. And when we do the amendment, we will send an email to the Inspire's mailing list and we'll update the Google calendars and so on. But that means some of the things that you might be looking for, maybe they're not out yet. Like, for example, our call for proposals for graduate student research. Generally, that comes out in November. So right now, it's just a TBD placeholder. But keep an eye out for it. Subscribe to the mailing list. And when it comes out, you'll see an email that says, hey, we've released it. You know, go take a look at that. Oh, and I have this blog as well for all the changes that we make, because any document like this, sometimes there are errors. We have all these different mailing lists. If you submit proposals through Inspires, you can create an account, you can sign up for the mailing lists. The general subscription list is where the amendments go, but each one of the divisions has their own lists. And so sometimes there are other things that are going on and they will send an email. So I wanted to just sort of whiz through that part and get to what I really want to talk about, which is my own sort of personal idiosyncratic advice about how to write proposals. But, you know, later, you know, you can please ask me whatever you want about roses. Okay, so first of all, know your requirements. I mean, it seems obvious, but you would be amazed. Every year there are proposals that, well, I mean, if the selecting official is strict, just get returned without review because the proposal was missing some component, right? So for example, most calls for proposals require that the proposal have an open science and data management plan. And for most proposals, that is evaluated as part of merit. It's part of the score. And so that's important. Calls for proposals may require other things. Some require a separate software development plan. Some have, for example, the calls for proposals that do dual anonymous peer review, they have special instructions. And we increasingly have, I think this year, I'm trying to remember how many, at least half a dozen, maybe a dozen, that require the inclusion plan. And so in each one of these cases, it's a little variation from the standard. It's something extra that must be included. And you wouldn't want to leave it out and get into trouble. Now, so the way this works is, if you're on this one of these tables of due dates, like table 2 here, and you can see the name is blue and underlined, it's a hypertext link, and you follow that link and it takes you to a page on NSPIRES. Although these are also synopsized on grants.gov, one can submit that way as well. So you go to the NSPIRES page, and there's a link to the PDF, and it would look like this. It would have the title, and in the front, I try to put, here's a case of one that was released later. It was a TBD placeholder at first. So you can see the notice says, hey, this was amended in September and we're releasing the text. Here you go. But then I try to use this bold notice in the front to draw your attention to anything unusual. Like in this case, say, hey, this one is participating in the inclusion plan pilot study. So go see this section. And that's a required additional section of the proposal that's not part of the default, that you would not see this in that generic guidebook for proposers, right? And so that's why I say, focus on what it says here in the program element. And then finally here, they say, oh, we have some templates here. We encourage you to use these, right? That kind of thing. Okay. This year we have, I think, it's just over 30 of our program elements, our calls for proposals, that are using the dual anonymous peer review. So, nominally, the way it's supposed to work is you submit a proposal and the proposer doesn't know who the reviewers are. That's always the case, supposedly, right? But the way DAPR works is that the reviewers don't know who the proposers are, at least not when they're doing the technical evaluation of the proposal. And so to make this work, there are instructions about how to separate out things that would identify the individual or the organization, and then the proposal gets reviewed. And I have a link here, and we have a web page with lots of information. And then for any call for proposals that does this, it would be in the bold notice, and we have instructions. And so, so you can't miss it, basically. So this is relatively new, and I think it's generated a lot of interest. A lot of people seem to like it. We do have some preliminary indications based on the data so far that there was some bias in the process, perhaps. For example, in the case, although we didn't see any difference in roses with male versus female PIs, they did see what appeared to be a difference in the Hubble GEO program, and perhaps, in the Hubble and JW. So it seems like that's getting rid of that difference. And then with it does seem like we're having more success with first-time proposers, and we're having a higher success rate for non-R1 organizations that don't normally propose to us, and they seem to be winning at a higher rate. So it's really interesting, and having actually been present at peer review panels where they were evaluating the anonymized proposals, the reviewers seem to really like it too. They like the way it focuses the review panel on the science rather than on the individuals. Now, I should say for those proposals that are in the selectable range, after the evaluation of the technical part of the proposal, there is this reveal where the reviewers have to do a verification. And, they do look and see who those individuals are. And they just verify, like, yeah, can these people, actually do this work? And so far, we've not had a case where the review panel liked the proposal and then looked at the proposers and said, oh my gosh, they're just a bunch of high school students. Like that just hasn't, that just hasn't happened. Okay. So let's talk about some of the most common weaknesses and the most common strengths that I've seen. I would say the most common is not enough detail. You allude to some process that you use in your data reduction or when you're working in the lab or whatever, and you know what you're talking about, but your reviewers don't know what you're talking about. So that's very common. And I think what this often derives from is sometimes I think if the proposal, well, any given call for proposal, with just one or two exceptions, there's a fixed page length for all the proposals. So an ambitious proposal with many tasks, it still gets this, gets no more words than a very focused proposal. And what that means is if one has a very ambitious proposals with many tasks and objectives, inevitably what that means is there's just less space to describe any given task. And so I think that maybe one is more likely to get a reviewer saying, well, there's just not enough here. I don't know how they're gonna do this. So that's I think where that comes from. Another common weakness that I've seen is a lack of a connection from where basically the reviewers get a little lost when they're in the proposal. Again, for these, especially for the complex ones, they're deep into the proposal. And, remember, they're reading a lot of these proposals and they just get a little lost. Like, wait, why are we doing this? And so I think it's helpful to be reminding the reviewers, hey, as I remind you, we're doing this in order, because once we measure this, this is going to be a test of that. And that's going to allow us to answer that original question, right? Because they read the original hypothesis in the introduction. They're now 5, 6, 7 pages into it, and like they're lost in the details. Yeah. And so then, conversely, I think that for the proposals that rate highly, you tend to see not only as a proposal, it's well written, but in addition, it has a compelling problem, because you can have a proposal that's beautifully written, but maybe it doesn't seem that important to the reviewers. I mean, maybe you understand its importance, but maybe you didn't lay that out clearly. And so there's this feeling of like, well, there's a nice proposal, but why do we really care about this? So you want it to be a compelling problem. The implementation has to be convincing that they say like, yeah, that this is going to get that answer, and it seems likely that that's going to work. And then, right, the impact I talked about, and then good use of figures and tables and good use of figure captions. My feeling was always that I should write my proposal such that if somebody is just paging through it and it's just kind of looking at the figures, that they can get the gist of it from that alone. What else? Change, correct existing assumptions. That's kind of already a way in which something can be high. These are sort of examples in which things could be high impact, I guess I would say. Really just sort of examples of the things mentioned before. Yeah. And it could be conceptual, you know, like changing a paradigm, but it could also be technological as well. A significant improvement in some, you know, hardware or methodology could actually have like a massive impact, even though, you know, maybe that's not, you know, it's not an idea change, but we have these calls for proposals that are about instrument development and methodology. So, you know, that also can be a high impact and great stuff. So yeah, so that's all important. I do think that it's one way or another, one has to get to this compelling proposal. And I think very often that this occurs because one has a good team, right? No, it's rare that one person has all of that knowledge that's needed. And I think it is really important to bring in people who have expertise that is complementary to one's own. And so, you know, I just on the slide, just talking about, you know, the importance of finding collaborators, finding mentors, you know, don't be afraid to share credit. And of course, improving one's capacity to communicate and getting out there to the meetings and communicating, that's so important for success. And so I think as you talk to your graduate students and your postdocs, you want to really push them to get out there and to talk about their research, because ultimately, you know, in it to be successful, obviously they need your mentorship, but ultimately they're going to need to be known to other people in the community and to forge collaborations that will ultimately support their future research. So that's really important. One of the things that some people don't know is that for all of our calls for proposals, and this is a screen capture from NSPIRES, in this case for an old heliophysics call for proposals from last year. But for all of these, after the selections are done, in the lower right-hand corner, there's a link there to a PDF file. And that lists the name of the PI and the organization and the abstracts of the proposals that were selected. And so that's really informative because you find out, you know, what is being supported now. And so it's another way to find out who's doing what and to see with whom one might collaborate. I mean, obviously part of it is going to meetings and, you know, reading the papers, but this is also another way to be aware of what's going on out there. Another really good thing for early career folks is to serve on review panels. As one of my mentors used to say, being on a review panel, it doesn't really teach you how to write a proposal, but it teaches you how not to write a proposal. So anyway, we do have on the NASA Science webpage, we have these web forms where one can sign up to, you know, you can volunteer to be a reviewer. And so I think that's a great thing for early career people to do. Please do that. And then on my webpage, I have a whole bunch of different resources there. There's these are just sort of the kinds of things that I wished I had when I was a proposer. And so I have links to grant statistics so you can see which programs have high selection rates and which have low ones, and all the points of contact. And in the library, as we call it, there are links to lots of talks about how to write a proposal, better than this one. One or two by me, but also by other people like Christina Ritchie from JPL and some folks at Goddard. And so there is a lot of useful stuff on the web. So I encourage you to, take a look at that and share those links with folks. And then, okay, so you submit your proposal and it gets reviewed, and okay, you didn't get funded, right? And so, okay, now, now what do you do? And so I guess the point that I always want to make is, so you're going to be annoyed, right? That's a given. And, obviously, they're morons because they didn't understand like what you wrote. But the thing is, just because they're idiots and, that weakness that they wrote is wrong, you still have to revise your proposal, right? Like, even though scientifically you're right and they're wrong, still, based on that comment, you now know, okay, I have to revise so that even an idiot can understand this, right? You gotta revise in response to comments. We talked about lack of detail being a common weakness. That's really tough because, again, because of that page limit. I mean, that's really sort of an art form, trying to figure out where to add detail, but then maybe it means something else has got to go. There is an inherent uncertainty in that review process. So, it's like plus or minus half a point. It does vary a bit from year to year. I have a little bit of data on that. And but I think it is important to note that one can request a debrief. Like, sometimes you get comments and you really don't understand them. And so, you can reach out to the program officer, ask for a debrief, and we given that we get thousands and thousands of proposals a year, that means even if we're right 99.9% of the time, it means some of the reviews are just wrong. And so one can request reconsideration. And I certainly have seen cases where weaknesses were wrong and they were eliminated. I've also seen cases where, they were upheld. So anyway, I've been talking for long enough. Rather than trying to anticipate what you want to hear, maybe I should just stop and let you ask questions and try to answer them. And there's my email address, my confidential email address. And so if you think of a question later, you can just write to me. So with that, I will stop sharing and
I'm here.
Ask for questions. Thank you.
All right, questions from anybody. The whole point of this next while when we have the classroom is to sort of, gather some information.
Senator Cochran, great talk because you did hit on a lot of things that were real. On the proposals that have no due dates and they have a rolling date, is there a gaming system of when is the best or the worst time to apply?
Good question.
Well, that's an interesting question. I can tell you what I do know is that the distribution of submitted proposals over time is not completely uniform. And so I can tell you that although it's no due date, the Roses has a cycle where it's released in February and then it closes at the end of March. And then the next Roses comes out in February. So there's this period of overlap. So one can always propose, like there's never a blackout time. But what that does mean is that if somebody began a proposal in November and then they got distracted and then they come back to it and they want to finish that proposal, then maybe they look at the calendar and they think, oh, Roses is going to end. This Roses is going to end in March. And I don't want to have to restart this proposal. So all of the people who started a proposal realize, oh, I better finish this up. And so one does get a spike in March. However, I don't know whether it's good or bad to submit at that time. I don't know if it makes any difference. It doesn't make a difference in terms of the money because the proposals are coming in all year round and they're being selected and they're being funded all year round. And frankly, let's say, you submit, I mean, obviously the program managers are keeping an eye on their budget and they're going to allocate only a quarter of their budget in the first quarter and, stuff like that. But frankly, even if you did get for some reason, you get a bunch of proposals in August or whenever, and you want to make a bunch of selections, but you're at the end of the fiscal year and you don't have enough money, well, it really doesn't matter because come October 1st, you're going to have more money. So it's not like, the fiscal year, it's not like the money will run out because the fiscal year doesn't align perfectly with the Roses year. Yeah, so I don't know that it really matters.
Okay, that's good.
Long answer to a short question, sorry.
Yeah, so if you write a proposal and it gets rejected and you need reviews and all of that, do you then have to wait for the subsequent year to recommit that? Or do they give you a period of time to review it, to revise it, and then resubmit it?
Right. The general rule for the no due date programs in general is one a year, one per Roses year, right? So because some of them wait for the proposals to build up. They get a critical mass and then they do a review and then, you get the reviews back. And so it's not that fast anyway. But the ones that get a lot of proposals or very few proposals, they're just kind of just reviewing them pretty much all the time. And so they were afraid of getting overwhelmed by they were afraid, to get the same proposal submitted, a half a dozen times in a given year. And so I think that most of them say one a year. I'm not positive that
And all the ones with specific due dates, step 1, step 2s, those are almost by default once a year.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I thought we were talking about the only case where you really.
There was confusion. Right.
I assumed we were talking about the case of no due date because that's the only case where you really could submit. But if they're different programs, then yeah. I mean, for example, when I ran this, sometimes there's a little bit of overlap between programs. And so you do have a case where, maybe a proposal can be retooled slightly. So you have that proposal that you submitted to, I don't know. I mean, maybe heliophysics might be a good example because heliophysics is sort of, you have that fields and particles stuff. It's going on in planetary science because there are planetary magnetospheres. You have the heliophysics division, and then you have some specifically with the Earth. And so, there are heliophysicists who are submitting to all, to more than one division. And so that's a case where you might retool something and then submit it to another call with a fixed due date, in which case that's totally fine. That's totally fine. Some divisions do have language where they say they don't want you to have the same proposal or essentially the same proposal in the running at the same time in more than one program. I think both heliophysics and planetary science have such rules. And then you get into this sort of, well, what's the same, right? But if there's a substantial difference between the proposals, then they're different proposals. But we can talk more about that maybe, or you can look at the overviews is where that would be described.
Other questions? Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, great talk, Max. I know one area that a lot of people sort of agonize over is the appropriate budget level. And I know the standard response is propose the dollar amount that you really need to do the research. But everybody does the arithmetic, you know, the announcement says we expect to have so many dollars, expect to fund so many programs, and they're really reluctant to go above certain price points. So what advice can you give people on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer, as it is in most of such cases, is kind of like, yeah, propose what you need within reason, right? So, for example, my experience with the programs that I ran is that, you know, each year we would, you know, do the math and we would report the average award value, and you know, we would say something like, well, last year, the average award size was 125K per year or whatever. But there was always a distribution, right? So if the average award size is 125 per year, you shouldn't be angsting if you're at 150 a year. But if you're at 300 a year, yeah, that's pretty big. That said, I mean, if the proposal gets an excellent rating, it's going to get funded. I think where one runs into trouble with the bigger budgets is sort of in the marginal case, where let's say a proposal got a, you know, a pretty good rating. And so maybe I've gotten to the point where I have enough money now just to select a couple, one or two more. And, you know, then there's this big thing, and it's just too much. I can't afford it, right? So certainly anytime your proposal is on the edge and then it's very expensive, well, then it's gonna be a lot more work for me to select it. Unless the review panel, you know, did two votes, right? Unless the review panel said, well, you know, we really like the theory, but we didn't like the observations or the experiments or whatever, you know, and they said, oh, this part over here is excellent, this sub, you know, section. But otherwise, yeah. So anyway, so there's a range. So as long as, if you're within a sigma, you know, you're fine. Like you should not be anxious about, you know, whatever, 10 or 20K. But, but yeah, if you are, you know, once you, I mean, there will always be a few that will be up at, you know, double the average. And also it depends on the program. In some programs, there's more variation, right? Like some, for example, in planetary science, there's a call for proposals called solar system workings. And it's a very broad call for proposals. And so you have all kinds of different stuff going on in there. And so, well, I mean, you know, some types of proposals are just more expensive than others. I mean, okay, when I ran the Cassini data analysis program, the cosmochemistry panel, those proposals were always more expensive because those involved experiments. And that's just sort of inherently more expensive than, you know, maybe the folks who you have one professor and one student and they're doing some modeling and it just doesn't cost as much, right? So I think it also depends on the nature of the program. Some programs that are broad, they maybe they'll give an average cost, but maybe there's a really wide distribution. Whereas other calls for proposals, all the proposals are pretty much the same. And then the distribution is much more narrow.
Yeah. Well, the associated question is there are some disciplines, such as planetary science, where a larger fraction of the people are on predominantly soft money positions, as opposed to fields with predominantly TTT faculty. And so if you get a proposal from somebody in a soft money position and a TTT faculty person doing basically the same work, just there's no way to avoid that soft money person needing to ask for more money to do the same work. So how do you deal with that?
Well, so one of the things that we've done and is that we're hiding the salary fringe overhead total budget from the peer reviewers. So we're removing that source of bias because I think we had all seen that. We had all seen cases where, you know, somebody would say like, oh, look at this proposal, you know, from SRI, the overhead is so high, right? Well, no, that's not the job of the peer reviewer. Like they shouldn't be, you know, and it was sort of hard for them. It's like in one of those movies where there's, you know, there's one of these legal TV shows or movies or something, and some point gets brought up, and the, you know, the judge will say, oh, ignore that. Well, yeah, you know, but it's all at a key point, you know, of the TV show that like it's really hard for the jury to ignore that once they know it, right? So one of the things that we do is we hide some of these costs. So when the peer reviewers are telling us which proposals they like, at least that is not tainted by the cost.
But you have to report the effort that they want to put into it, the number of person months of effort. And, you know, once again, if it's a tenure track faculty person, you know, they're just going to request a couple of summer months, where it might be really 6 months of effort.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're supposed to put in the time that they're actually going to use, whether we're paying for it or not, but okay. But that, I mean, I don't know how much the peer reviewers are really paying attention to that. I mean, what they're really supposed to do is they're supposed to assess, is the time that they're allocating appropriate to do this task? And honestly, I remember cases where the peer review panel was concerned because the time allocated was too low. And I think it was the case that you described, where it was somebody who was at a university and they really did have the time to spend on it, but they weren't allowed to say, well, yeah, I am going to be spending this time on it. Because, so actually we changed a little bit. The table of work effort is outside of the budget section. And at least from what I was told when I went to some of these, there are these meetings that are associations of universities, like the Federal Demonstration Project and COGR and stuff like that. And I was told that by moving that table of work effort out of the budget, and by explicitly saying, like, I understand this is just not, this is an estimate, and this doesn't constitute, you know, officially, this doesn't constitute cost sharing, that I was able to get, I think that maybe folks are being a little bit more honest about their time. But all of that said, that's a way, all of this stuff is a way to try to remove the bias this might introduce in the review process. But ultimately, when it comes time to make selections, then, you know, the budget for that program is what the budget is. And I think it can be harder to select things that are more expensive. But that said, the folks in the Planetary Science Division are, for example, they're aware that they have more soft money people, for example. And, you know, many of them came from positions like that. I used to be a soft money scientist at the SETI Institute. And so I think that that's understood and that's taken into account. I mean, in the end, you know, they want to support good work, you know, and if they get a lovely proposal, they're going to support it. And yeah, okay, that person's soft money and, you know, maybe they cost a little more, but, you know, and frankly, we are paying for civil servants as well. So they're expensive. Their time is coming out of the programmatic budget.
We probably have time for one more before we should probably give the room back. Yeah, okay, Mark.
So my question when I read a proposal is always the balance between a really focused, narrow, something I could practically do myself and putting together like a team. And which obviously then becomes more expensive, but sort of in the past I've always tended to sort of inherently view an integrated proposal as something more attractive. And I'm just curious whether, you know, whether NASA is okay. I'm questioning my assumptions there. Whether, you know, maybe focused proposals, you know, maybe actually smarter and are whether they're acceptable to NASA. Well, how
you know, yeah, that's tough. There, yeah, that's boy, that's really tough. There's always, you want to strike the balance. I think that we were talking about the budget situation, right? And there's an estimate, you kind of have an idea of what the average budget is. And so if by adding more, if you wanted to do something really ambitious and say, like, I used to be an experimentalist, and maybe I want to add an observer and I want to add a theorist. And at some point I have to look at my budget. And if I'm now at, double or more the average award size, then I'm going to start getting anxious. And then also, as I said, there's this problem that, you still only have 15 pages or whatever. On the other hand, if it's just you, there are things that you can't do. And there's no question about it, that there are times when, you see reviewers look at a proposal and they think, oh boy, they say that they're going to make this measurement and they're going to come up with this parameter. And they say that this parameter is of value. But boy, how much more compelling would this proposal be if they didn't just generate this value, but then they had a funded COI to whom they handed that off, and the COI incorporated that value into their model, right? And they said, and now we're going to test it and we're going to do feedback and we're going to see if it works, right? So that's just so much more compelling. So there's always that trade-off there. So I think you want to hit the sweet spot. Oh, you know what you could do that I did once back when in the day, where a friend of mine and I, we were both, he's a theorist and I was an experimentalist, and we were both interested in the mechanism by which amino acids formed, the amino acids that are seen in meteorites, right? And there's this notion that it forms by a Strecker synthesis. And so the nitrogen comes from the CN, the carbon attached to the amino group comes from a CN and in like an amino, like a nitrile. How does that happen? That carbon actually becomes the acid group, maybe. And so we had this argument about it, and we had this bet. And I said, I think it happens this way. And he said he thinks it happens that way. And we wanted to do a big proposal together, but it was just too expensive. And so what we actually ended up doing is submitting the proposals to the same program in the same year. And we referred to each other's proposals. And I said, this is the mechanism. I'm right. David is wrong. And then David submitted a proposal that said, I'm right. Max is wrong. And here are our proposals. And basically, if you fund both of these, it would be better than if you funded either one of these alone. And we did get funded. So sometimes that works. Sometimes that works.
All right, we should probably end it there. Thanks, Max, very much for this for the talk, for the conversation. And I will make this PowerPoint present available to everybody.
Thank you.
And also he gave his website and his email for recording. And it's been recorded. Right.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and you feel free to send me email later if you have Rose's questions.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you, everyone.